And since you can't see me, I just thought I'd put up some snapshots so you have an idea of who's yammering at you. So I'm in the economics department at the University of Exeter, and I'm working on this project which I thought you might be interested in. And the question is, it deals with this, let's say, new type of impact information that's coming out and being promoted. And we don't know a lot about how donors will respond to it and how that depends on the presentation of it. Although I noticed we did have some discussions of different possible presentations of metrics in yesterday's talks. Okay, so this is the major question of the project. Sorry, I just have to go to the next screen. Okay, sorry. You now see the next screen. It says, does impact matter to donors? Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so this is an organization called impactmatters.org that Dean Carlin is fueling, but there's a variety of organizations fueled by the EA movement and other supporters pushing charities to help them, to give them information to help them calculate a particular scientifically, academically supported type of impact measure, which I'll explain in a moment in brief. And I think this will increasingly become an important force. I think there will be audiences and groups of donors and powerful people that do get behind this. Here's another organization which you may have heard of more called GiveWell. And they also do these sorts of rankings, and I'll show you a picture of their rankings in just a moment. Sorry, rankings is the wrong word, ratings, quantitative ratings of this measure of impact, which, from the description, you're maybe starting to get the idea of, if you're not perhaps already very familiar with this. So they're promoting measures such as lives saved per dollar, or how many dollars will it cost, according to their estimates, their best consensus estimates based on scientific data and analysis, of how much it costs via a particular intervention, via a particular charity to, for example, save a life. So I think we need to know a lot more, and there hasn't been a lot of testing about how potential donors will respond to this analytical information. Will it, in fact, energize them to be more effective givers, to give more, or will these analytical measures switch off their inherent empathy? And perhaps relevant for the current audience, given that there is this push for this, how and when should you advertise your impact? And how can you know whether it's going to have a positive or a deleterious effect? And we'll get to some evidence of that in a moment. So if I have a chance to get to all of this, I've outlined the question. I'm going to go into some detail about what previous research suggests. The previous research is, yes, somewhat limited, but still, there's no point in me not to stand on the shoulders of those that came before me. So let me just give you a little bit of a briefs on some of this in case we don't have time, and so you can start anticipating questions. I would say that ultimately, the question is, how do people deal with this impact information or effectiveness information? Should you present it, and why is it important? The previous results have been rather mixed, as are the results from the experiments I will present to you. But they hint at positive or null effects. In other words, there's not evidence that presenting this impact information is really turning off donors in the way it might have been feared. So it's worth considering presenting it, and it can have positive impacts on the sector, I would argue. Okay, so I'd like to work with you and with charities and people in the sector and mediators to run field experiments and trials, let's say through your standard platforms, through mail, through postal, mail solicitations, and also to run trials with digital and social media, let's say advertisements on Facebook that I could put on your behalf, and perhaps I could finance those with academic grants, or we could share the financing if the formula works out right. And then there's a few other projects pages that you might be interested in. One is a website called innovationsandfundraising.org, which summarizes the information or tries to bring a connection between academia and practice in what works in this sector. And another idea called Give If You Win which you might find interesting. Okay, so what do we mean by effectiveness? The type of output we're talking about. So you see there's a Make-A-Wish to Disney World, and then there's bed nets. Okay, so we're not only talking about how efficient a charity is at providing its output, or how much overhead they have, or what their fundraise. We're not even going to be thinking about their fundraising expenditure ratio, but we're going to be thinking also about what the output is and how much effect that output has, because the measure we're talking about cares about human and environmental outcomes. A little bit of mathematics. We'll talk about the beneficial outcome that can be achieved by charity I with total donations G. In other words, what can they produce with these donations? So that measure could be lives saved or quality adjusted life years added, but it's not just the output. It's not just how many bed nets did we provide or how many paintings we purchased. In fact, it's the product of those two things. How many of these outputs did we purchase per dollar, and then how much impact did we have per output? Or to be more specific, by this conception, the donor will consider the marginal impact they had of each dollar donated. So what was the impact of my donation on the amount of, on the statistical lives that could have been saved? And this is what these organizations attempt to measure. And you can look widely at their measures and others' reports, look at the Life You Can Save organization, that this varies greatly. So this is their metric, or this is the sort of spreadsheet they use to perform their metric. So you see sort of bottom line cost per equivalent life saved for some of the charities that they favor relative to another charity that they see as the benchmark, which is Give Directly, basically just giving cash directly to poor people. It's not this kind of impact, which maybe you're more familiar with, such as that provided by Charity Navigator. I mean, the overhead rate or fundraising ratio is now widely seen to be a fairly uninformative measure of impact. So measures of transparency and financial stability are good, but far from sufficient to have impact. So I could be a squeaky clean provider of an intervention that actually has no positive impact. So for instance, giving children the gift of toy guns for Christmas probably doesn't have a great good for the world. Okay, so if we look back to we could look at what notions of behavioral economics, or perhaps an ideal that people might be impact altruists, caring about the marginal impact of their donation. But there's many results in psychology from various areas that suggest it might in fact shut down empathy, providing this impact information. So there's the idea that empathy is innumerate, that people are not good at processing this analytical information, that generosity is spontaneous, whereas self-interest is deliberative and slower. So that presenting the information will allow the person to make themselves more selfish. There's also the idea that people will use excuses not to give, motivated reasoning, or that presenting this information will shift them away from the social sharing norm to the market norm. So there's a variety of stories, many of which point in the direction that this information should actually be harmful to giving. But there's not a lot of strong evidence.
Oops, we have lost David.
Do you still hear me? Do you still hear me?
You're back.
Okay, sorry, the connection's not so good at my university. So it's been claimed, and there's quite a bit of strong evidence that in fact, presenting an individual identified victim is a fairly effective method, or is fairly effective at eliciting emotional altruism and compassionate altruism and people making donations in experiments in a variety of contexts. And Small et al. Present the idea that, so they present papers in which individuals who faced an identifiable victim donated more. They ran these experiments. They've donated more than those who faced just statistics about victims, and also more than those who faced both of the identifiable victim and the statistics. So the statistics seemed to have a diminishing effect, or effect going in the opposite direction. In other words, counteracting the identifiable victim effect. Another study suggested that priming analytic thinking reduced donations to an identifiable victim relative to a feeling-based thinking prime. So the prime involved either math problems or more social, so it was more of a social priming. But they had no distinct effect on donations to statistical victims. So arguing that the the analytical-based prime particularly switched off this empathic channel of giving. But I have quibbles with many of these studies. They're mainly small scale. They're not always in realistic contexts. The identified victim, that the way that they state it is not a way a charity could really present it in many cases. People know that they're participating in a study for most of these experiments, and many of them, in fact, involve hypothetical giving rather than real giving. And I'll just leave it at there rather than quibble too much. But there is evidence from field and observational contexts. Okay, so the Charity Navigator information, there's some evidence that it has positive effect on giving, but it's a bit weak evidence. And also, that is not the impact evidence I'm talking about. There's a study also presenting financial information that found it actually, and this was a field study, that had it actually a very positive impact. So there was some impact there among prior donors, and also another study done by Dean Carlin suggested where they presented a treatment and a control mailer. And the difference was just basically, this was again for a real charity, a hunger-based charity, whether they presented this information that had an analytical flavor, right? Conducted scientifically rigorous impact studies, and you see some numerical measures there, and rather than the emotional information. So it's not a perfectly clean test because they took one thing out and put something else in. What did they find? Little net effect, but a positive effect on large prior donors. A negative effect on small prior donors, positive on large prior donors. Okay, so now the studies that I've run, and I should have gone to these earlier, I'll try to go fairly quickly. So these all involved actual charitable asks. They either involved participants on the MTurk platform who knew basically they were participating in some sort of experiment, or university students who were completing a survey having to do with participation in a social sciences lab, but then were asked a charitable giving question at the end, which presumably they did not think was part of the experiment. And what we varied was measures of both the effectiveness and whether an emotional image was presented. Some people got both, some people got one, some people got the other, some people got neither. That's what we mean by 2 by 2. So this was the sort of nature of the emotional image that most of Robin's MTurk studies presented, and this was the sort of analytical information they presented. Again, this was Charity Navigator. I'll go through some of the details rather quickly. It was either a small amount of money or a raffle for $50. And they were either asked to donate to one charity or two in the same category. And here's the sort of chart of all of the variations we've tried and the sample sizes. And in some, for studies 5 and 6, we were actually able to introduce the sort of impact measure that I'm talking about. So let me just jump through these. It also varied the timing, and I'll vary the timing and combinations in different ways. And here's what it came out as. Sorry, this is jumping a bit off the page, possibly. But basically, let me just summarize what came out of these studies. So the impact information consistently had strong positive effect on both donation incidents and amounts. However, the effectiveness information had little impact on either donation incidents or amounts. And statistically speaking, I can say it's not just that the results were all over the place, but we can say there's a fairly tightly bounded null effect. We can probably rule out a large effect in either direction of the effectiveness information. Okay, I'm not going to present to you the more detailed statistics there. Okay, the final study was the one that I was most involved in. As I said, it occurred after a lot of other questions, and people were asked, do you want to donate from this Amazon voucher you could win if you win? They were given information about blindness in general and then a conditional donation question. So here's the sort of questions they were asked, lots of survey questions, many survey questions. And then they were either given one or both of these two things. Okay, so everyone got this introduction screen, explaining the situation, explaining why blindness is important, it is an important issue. The idea was you've earned this money, now you have a chance to potentially donate it. And then half the participants got this, which I think is a very visually striking image of a blind girl. And half of the participants, I should say a quarter got both, a quarter got one of these, and a quarter got neither of these. So a quarter got this description of the two charities you could donate to, as well as the choice boxes. Which, if either, would you like to donate to if you win? And it just describes what donations, the donations to the cause do. It describes basically what the charity does. So one was a guide dogs charity, a UK-based charity providing guide dogs. The other was the Carter Center to Prevent River Blindness, one to eliminate river blindness, to distribute a medicine. The other version of it, so in both cases they could tick which they wanted to donate to, if any. The other version of it also included this additional information about each. So it included information about the outputs. So what did it cost per working guide dog partnership per day? And what did it cost per an outcome, like the lifetime cost of a guide dog? Or in this case, how much does it cost per medicine dose per year? Or how much does it cost to likely reduce 10 to 50 years of a serious debilitation? This is from a legitimate estimate. So, you could pay this is the classic case presented by Singer. You could pay £75 to prevent blindness, or a lot more, 75 pounds will get you just a few weeks of a guide dog. Okay, then they were asked how much if they chose to donate, they were asked how much do they want to donate. They could also indicate zero. And what were the results of this study, which I've also somewhat summarized in the other? Well, there was limited power. We need to run more of this. But the one thing that did come out is the image we presented reduced donation to guide dogs. It did increase donation to river blindness, but not in a statistically significant way. And if you look at the histograms of the donations, just mapping the donations across these different treatments to guide dogs and river blindness, you see not a lot of difference. It looks almost like the same. So again, the information did not have a very large effect in these contexts. Okay, let me sum up. Okay, so there's going to be another study that's in this set that also presented a form of impact information. So if you don't want to hear, please, turn off your eyes for a moment. This is going to be presented today. What was found was that the impact-related information had some positive effect. Okay, so to sum up, images seem to work also at motivating giving to these highly impactful charities, such as the River Blindness Charity, perhaps because of the nature of that image. Information seems not to hurt, and in some context, it seemed to help. If we think about the previous studies, and if we think about the donor's voice mailing, which you'll see presented soon. So it seems like something worth exploring further, and maybe something that you will feel compelled to introduce as part of your presentation. And there's mixed impact on the interaction effect. All right, finally, as I said, I want to work with you to run experiments, perhaps of this flavor, responses to real impact per dollar information presented in various ways, through standard platforms, through things that I can help finance with my own research grants. And I also wanted to mention, as I said, I have this site that's trying to present an evidence base on what works in charitable giving. You might find it interesting. I'd be very keen to hear your opinions. And another thing I'm keen to test, apparently the slide is not there for some reason, is this thing called Give If You Win. You can go to giveifyouwin.org to look that up. So yeah, so that's basically all I have to say. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, David. Nick, do we have any questions for David?
None as of yet.
Just to clarify something, the study that David was referencing that you're going to hear about is Larissa's presentation, Catholic Relief Services.
And we do have a question as to what the demographics were for the sampling.
That's a good question. It depends on which of the studies we're talking about, obviously, but the people in what I called the MTurk studies. Those were, I believe, non-students, Americans who are these things called MTurkers, people who participate in studies on that platform. People in the final study that I presented, the one at the University of Essex, which it had the most perhaps field aspect to it because people didn't know they were in the study. Those were participants in the Essex lab. So people who were participants, mainly students, and mainly actually non-British students, so students from all around the world.
Great. Any other questions?
That is all we have.
Okay. And obviously, sorry. Well, there's other details I could mention, but sorry, go ahead.
We have 4 minutes till our break, so go ahead if you want to share something else.
No, I just wanted to mention that obviously in the field experiments mentioned, those were just some of the field experiments I mentioned were the general population of donors or previous donors giving to charities like the hunger charity, and okay, if I do have 4 minutes, I just wanted to mention this other idea that you might be interested in exploring, particularly if you're doing fundraising, perhaps in the financial sector, or with people who are receiving bonuses or anticipating uncertain inheritances or uncertain gains, lottery gains, investment returns. And that's the idea, is give if you win. And there's academic evidence that people may be especially generous if you ask them questions like, if you win a bonus, how much will you donate to charity? Relative to if you ask them immediately after they get the bonus. So this is another project that I was hoping to potentially work with charities on, considering putting out requests and interfaces where people could be asked, are you in your line of work, do you anticipate a variable income? Do you anticipate a bonus? Would you be interested in committing some share of this bonus in the future, to trying that as an approach? And as I said, we have some experimental evidence that from the sort of field settings I've already mentioned that this may be an effective approach.